Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our tea corner. Today, I'm very happy to have with us John Dora. John Dora is a friend because we work together in the ISO. I am more involved in the mitigation area, but John is very expert in the adaptation area. And we take the opportunity to discuss a very interesting standard. It's the 4090, and John will explain the connection of this standard with ISO 2001 environmental management system. As you know, the rules of the tea corner is to have almost around 10 minutes for John to introduce the topic, and then we have an open discussion altogether with John. So John, the floor is yours, and welcome to our tea corner.
Thank you very much, Daniela. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about ISO 14090 and also to look at how it links in with 14001. I think I've managed to share my screen.
Yes.
It's working? Yeah, good. So I should talk briefly about 14090 and a little bit about 14001. Of course, my experience is more in the 14090 area, and I was privileged to be the convener of the working group that drafted 14090, and there's a lot of interest in adaptation just now. I need to talk about 14090 and adaptation. Adaptation has ramped up in the past few years in terms of importance and recognition. Indeed, I think it was yesterday, President Biden in the USA has asked government departments to look at adaptation and resilience as a priority, because we're now realizing that the climate is changing more rapidly than we thought a few years ago, and mitigation efforts, while much more mature as a concept, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the concept's been around for a long time. We're realizing that we're going to be going into a climate that's not going to change in a beneficial way for a very long time. So adaptation is very important. And adaptation, of course, itself is very context specific. Mitigation, we can look at greenhouse gas management and manage greenhouse gas emissions. Adaptation, about making society, making sectors resilient, is very specific to the sector. The Paris Agreement refers to adaptation. The UN Sustainable Development Goals refer to adaptation. And 1490, ISO 1490, is a framework that helps people produce adaptation plans. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's a framework. And some drivers behind adaptation that we're seeing just now are things like the Green Deals, building back better. These sort of themes are going through governments all around the world. Corporate social responsibility pressures, investment banks wishing to see their investments being resilient to the future climate, because they're investing over 20, 30 years, and the climate's going to be markedly different. And we're seeing as well recognition of immediate vulnerabilities. Coastlines are suffering sea level rise and increased storminess, and flooding is a big issue around the world. But one of the things I want to pick up here is, if you use ISO 14001 and understand the principles behind environmental management systems, then ISO 14090 can really help with environmental management. Users of 14001 understand mitigation. They realize that climate change adaptation is becoming a high priority. From things I've just said, mitigation will take decades to impact, and the impacts are accelerating. But 14001 requires consideration of environmental conditions. And ISO 14090 provides that framework to look at the environmental conditions brought about by climate change. It talks about understanding, responding, and adapting to the effects of climate change. 14090 has, like all ISO standards, an introduction and principles behind what's in the document itself. But there's one or two very useful clauses in 1490, and this one about pre-planning is quite an interesting area to look at. Pre-planning, clause 5. Pre-planning is a requirement in the standard to look at the rest of the standard to see how fit your organization is to carry out adaptation. So it looks at capacity and capability across risk and vulnerability assessments, across decision-making capability, across governance, leadership, knowledge, and data. And many organizations now are looking at that area to see how fit they are to carry out adaptation over 10, 20, 50 years. But the other clauses are of course, very important. Assessing climate change impacts looks at how organizations have to carry out some sort of impact assessment, which might be a risk assessment, or it might be a vulnerability assessment, or a thresholds analysis. Adaptation planning looks at taking what we're learning from the rest of the standard and putting them together in a plan. And in adaptation planning, we look at things like adaptive capacity and leadership and governance and how to deal with uncertainty, because the climate future is very uncertain and we need to be able to change our adaptation plans and methodologies over time as the climate changes. Clause 7 gives the adaptation plan. Clause 8 talks about turning that plan into action with some requirements on making sure that the top managers of an organization commit to adaptation and support the whole organization. We all know that reluctant people higher up an organization, and how to persuade them to support us in our adaptation planning is dealt with in this document. Monitoring and evaluation, well, implementation comes with indicators that are monitored and evaluated, and a key principle in the standard is that we take that learning through the evaluation process and bring it back up through the rest of the standard, so as we learn and adapt our plans over time. So even the plans are adaptive. And reporting communication, the standard is rounded off with a short piece on reporting, where organizations, if they do report to their interested parties, then they shall follow certain rules like transparency. I need to come out of this and go to the next slide. There we are. I somehow have the annotations on here. I need to clear these. Yes, that's it, cleared. There's a white paper just about to be published by ISO showing how ISO 14090 helps 14001. And I led a small team of ISO experts late last year, or throughout last year, to produce a document. And on this slide and the next slide, there's some samples of this crossover table that we derived to show users of 14001 how ISO 14090 supports 14001. And just one example here, 4.4 Environmental Management System is supported by clauses 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 in ISO 14090 by offering guidance on how to assess an organization's activities, products, and services, how they might be impacted by climate change, and on planning actions for climate adaptation, which help the overarching requirement in ISO 14001 by establishing and continually improving the environmental management system. So there's good guidance in this white paper. I've just today actually asked ISO, after we've had a consultation round on the final version of this white paper, I've asked them if they could publish this paper. So it might be appearing on ISO's website tomorrow, this white paper. I'm just trying to find my cursor. Yes, And this is another example of the rest of the crossover table. So we can see in support, clause 7, clauses 5, 6, 1, and 10 in ISO 14090 help the support clause in 14001. 5, leadership, there's a whole series of standards there in 14090 that help. 6, planning, it's clauses 6, but mainly clauses 7 for the adaptation plan, and 8.2, the implementation plan. So I haven't put all the text in these tables because it make it look even more cluttered. So that's a flavor of the white paper, which, like I said, should be published tomorrow, all being well with the ISO systems and authorizations and so on. So 10 minutes, Daniela, I was asked. Is that all right? That was a very quick, short presentation.
Yes, perfect time as usual. I have already some questions, but before to ask you some explanation, some more detail, I like to know if somebody else want to have some question for you. Please open your microphone or write your question on the chat. Otherwise, I start. So you say assessment of climate change impact is one of the points in 4090. It seems to be a quite challenging point. May you give some more information, some elaboration of this particular aspects?
Yeah, the assessment of impact, there is a requirement in ISO 14090, and here's my well-worn paper copy of 14090. And I'd just like to refer to section 6. The standard requires organizations to assess how their activities, products and services might be impacted by climate change. So they have to assess the impacts. There's quite a lot of guidance on what they might look at in terms of the impacts, like water scarcity impacts on operations, or impacts on financial institutions, placing a premium on investment with high risk. So the guidance listed of impacts that might come about. And then it talks about climate parameters that could cause these impacts. The hazards might be things like temperature, high temperature or rapid change in temperature, precipitation, rainfall, snowfall, humidity, sea level rise, freeze thaw cycles. So there's hints in there as to what to look at. But there's also a set of guidance that we recognized when we were drafting this standard, that some organizations use risk assessments that look at likelihood and consequence. Others look at risk assessments that look at vulnerabilities, hazards, and exposure. And some organizations very much use vulnerability assessment tools. So what we said in ISO 14090 was that there are these methods to assess impacts: risk assessment, vulnerability assessment, and thresholds analysis. But we don't specify which one you choose. That's up to the organization to use their own preferred method. And we just give some guidance. You know, if a risk assessment approach is adopted, the assessment can include the consideration of likelihoods and consequences.
This is a very important point in terms of methodology. But I have another question in terms of dimension, because when we speak about adaptation, we have the problem to assess the actual impact and the future impact.
Yes.
So in which direction suggested to look the standard?
The standard talks about, in fact, it's very much focused on making decisions. So it talks about when we look at capacity in an organization and decision making in the organization, we ask the users of the standard to look at the lifetime of a decision. So in my own background, I've worked in railways and I've worked in flood risk. So if I'm designing a tidal barrier on a river to stop sea level rise and high tides affecting the town, Venezia, I think London, then if I'm designing one now, how long is it going to last? 100 years, 200 years? And if it lasts a long time, we recommend that the users of the standard look at that lifespan of the decision and what uncertainties there might be and how best to deal with those. So you might have risk assessments that are giving you a broad range of outcomes in the long term.
Sorry, I have still another point, because you mentioned some you mentioned Venice, and we know very well the Mose, is the barrier to protect from the sea, and this is exactly a critical point, no? Because the design of Mose was coming from 20 years ago, but the reality of the future will be completely different.
Yes.
And then the point is where we may find data to look in the future.
Yeah, there's guidance, very little guidance in this document about finding the data for the future, but it points at some global frameworks for climate data. But the nowadays, because when we drafted that part of this standard, that's a couple of years ago. Nowadays, I would advise people look at organizations like Copernicus Climate Services in Europe, and I'm actually working with them with Copernicus to look at what data we need for design of things in the future. I'm doing some work with SEN on the structural Eurocodes for future design. So there are organizations like Copernicus that can offer climate data for the future. The World Bank's got a portal for climate data for the future. And every country's own meteorological office does have some sort of group that's looking at future data. So there are lots of organizations that provide data and information on future.
Sorry.
No, I was going to say, because there's a lot of uncertainty, though, we do advise, when I speak to clients on adaptation, I do advise them to look at taking an adaptive pathway approach to design.
So you mentioned Copernicus, and I take the opportunity to ask you if Europe is in a good position in the preparation of standard guidelines on adaptation, because I know that you're also involved at the same level. So maybe you may give some more information from that side.
Yeah, I think, Daniela, to be quite honest, I think Europe is well out in front in this area. The thing about it, because standards rely on volunteers and take a long time to change, the pace of change is very slow. But Europe, I think, is in a good place there, understanding some of these challenges. And I'm hoping that by the end of this year or by the middle of next year, we'll have the next generation structural Eurocodes that will help design for things like temperature effects and wind and snow. And there'll be guidance available on how to deal with rainfall and other climatic factors by the end of this year, beginning of next year. Because the standards say one thing, but people who choose to use the standards can choose different parameters as long as they're compliant with the minimum standards in things like the structural Eurocodes.
Okay, but I'm speaking too much. I'd like to know if somebody has some questions, some request of clarification or comments. Please raise your hand. Nobody at the moment. So I have one more point, John. This is the framework standard. So if we have the framework, we expect to have some content within the framework, inside the framework. So do you expect that a future standard will be developed to complete the landscape, not only with the framework, but also with internal content?
Yeah, there's one or two already in the pipeline there. There is the expectation when we set up with 14,090 that volunteers would express a desire and the market would want particular specific topics covered. And we've already had ISO TS 14092 published, which is adaptation to climate change planning for local authorities. So it's a technical specification, doesn't have the full force of the standard, but it provides guidelines tailored to the local authority sector.
Crucial point.
And today, I think it's today, the working group responsible for 14,091, which is impact, risk and vulnerability, are, I think, finalizing the publication copy of that standard. So within the next few weeks, this will be a second adaptation standard being published. And the idea there was for particular topics of sectors, we could take the framework from 14,090 and dig into more detail, like risk assessment. We don't give much guidelines on risk assessment or vulnerability assessment in 14,090, but 14,090 will be a guideline that goes into detail. So people can choose to use that to fill one of the detail areas that 14,090 just offers a framework around. And I'm working with ISO to work a strategy for where we go with other standards. There's been some discussion about whether the next standard in the framework would be one on monitoring and evaluation, for example. And the UK British Standards Institution are soon to publish a British standards on using adaptive pathways to deal with uncertainty. And that fills a gap in the ISO 14,090 framework that might at some stage be adopted by ISO. So these are the thoughts that I've got in terms of a strategy. But the main thing is people have got to say and volunteer to help produce supporting documents for 14,090, because as Daniela, you know it, I know it, there are too few adaptation experts in the world to go around to do all this. And we need some good help to get more standards in the adaptation field drafted.
Yeah. And we have one expert here. We have Domenico Caudioso from Italian side. I'm happy that Domenico is here. Mimo, if you have any question, please go ahead.
Maybe I have a sort of preliminary question to John. In fact, my question to him would be if you are expecting a large audience for this standard. And the reason for asking this is that adaptation is a topic where the UNFCCC does not manage to agree on standard and guidelines for reporting by states. This was one of the problems left unsolved in Madrid. So are you expecting a large audience, not only by private, but also by administrations and municipalities and so on?
That's a very good point, Domenico. My wish is that we have a very large audience. The publication of the white paper that links 14,090 to 14,001 is a step in publicizing 14,090, because 14,001 is the second best-selling standard. So I'm hoping that will help advertise and push the fact that we need more adaptation. What's happening in terms of extreme weather and slow onset change, sea level rise, I'm hoping will give a impetus to people to want to use this standard. But having said that, I'm also aware that UNFCCC and ISO are in dialogue to bring together both organizations so as ISO can help the UN with their quest. And even just yesterday, I was having a call with the Climate Change Coordination Group at ISO about how we will engage with the COP process in Glasgow towards the end of this year. And there's some very high level thoughts and very high level discussions going on, which I hope will bring a breakthrough in that area. But I'm always optimistic in this area. I always try to think best. There are always obstacles, but it's a challenge to me.
But we need to underline that in the last 3 years, we start to have more cooperation between ISO and UNFCCC, because we had in any COP we had side events explaining ISO standard, explaining the opportunity to use the voluntary standard in the process. So for sure, this is the path in front of us.
Yeah.
Domenico, do you have any further question or comment?
No, not for the moment.
Okay. In terms of implementation, John, do you have any idea at the moment? You are on the front line, so you have more the sensation, understanding of us on the level of implementation of this standard. May you give some feedback on it?
The implementation, I'm getting more and more interest from people on using the standard. I'm in negotiation with a few companies, organizations in Canada, for instance, for training around ISO 14090, helped by the Standards Council Canada, helped by personal contact with a couple of organizations in Canada. In the UK, we've had, I'm actually working a contract with the National Trust, which is an organization that looks after land and old buildings and old paintings and coastline and parkland. And we're doing some work for them looking at adaptation using 1490. And indeed, over the past few months, I've been party to a number of bids in Germany and one or two other countries where these people have specified how do we measure up against ISO 14090. So I think things paused because of COVID, the coronavirus. But in the past 3 to 4 months, things are starting to build up. There's a link, my last slide on this, which I'm happy for the PDF to be shared, talks about the training modules that we've developed.
Please share.
If I share my screen, I'll show you that. Share that one. Yeah, there's a brochure. We've got 6 modules, a foundation module and 5 other modules for ISO 14090. Each module is a 2-day module. And we're working with a British firm, JBA Consulting, who I've worked with for a number of years in flood risk management work, but they're helping us develop this course. And we're starting in March, with a 2-day foundation course, 24th and 25th of March. That's almost full. And we can take 8 people on the module. But we're starting to hear people want to be trained in ISO 14090. So that's why we've stepped up to produce this training course. And if people enroll on this course, they'll hear my voice again. So that might not be very good.
Okay, I also thinking that could be very interesting to organize this kind of event, like this presentation, like T-Corner, maybe with having more time in connection with UNI, the Italian standardization body, because here we have accredited accreditation body, and maybe we may organize something to try to link the standardization body and the certification body to explain more the opportunity to combine 40019 with 40001. So maybe we may think in the next weeks or months to organize something in this direction.
That'd be really good, Daniela. The other thing I remember from the conversation with ISO yesterday and the COP is that the COP isn't just a UK thing this year, it's jointly organized with Italy.
Yeah.
And British standards are working towards doing some good stuff there. ISO is working towards some good stuff. So UDI should be in there as well, I think.
Yeah. Yes. Now there is a music on the ground, the background, and it means that we are at the end of our T-Corner. I like to remember to underline that in February, the 17th of February, we will have another interesting topic, is a blockchain, the use of blockchain to cope against climate change. think is another interesting topic. And so I hope to see all of you in 1 month from now. And I like to thanks again John Dora for the excellent presentation and for the participation to our Tea Corner. Thanks again, John.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and thanks for the question, Domenico.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Ciao.